The prairie wind carried dust across the small frontier town, rattling the shutters of wooden homes and whistling through the cracks in the church steeple. It was a town split between promises and reality, where the rich men in pressed coats raised their glasses in the saloon while the ranch hands nursed broken knuckles and broken dreams. Folks said opportunity lived here, but in truth, opportunity chose her favorites. And when she did, she often picked the ones with family names carved into courthouse doors. That was the way of the mayor's son. Tall, polished, and full of fine talk, he promised a future stitched in grandeur. He spoke of stone mansions with staircases curling like ribbons, of wide verandas with rocking chairs that overlooked endless wheat fields, of a life lifted above the grit and smoke of town. He had the bloodline, the coin, and the charm. Folks listened because they wanted to believe him, and maybe because they didn't know better. But on the other side of that same dusty street was the drifter. He was not polished, nor did he pretend to be. His boots carried the memory of 100 roads, and his coat smelled of wood smoke and saddle leather. He had no family name, no mansion waiting at the edge of town, no polished promises. What he offered instead was rougher something rooted in pine logs and a patch of land, a place carved out with hard work, not gold. And when his eyes fell on someone, they carried a weight not of promise, but of possession, fierce and unyielding. Between the mayor's son and the drifter lay the heart of the story. It was not only a story of love, but of choices, of the sweet temptation of dreams and the hard, bitter truth of survival. For in those days, a woman's future often balanced on a man's word, and words could be softer than butter or sharper than a knife. The mayor's son would smile in the lamplight, his hands gentle as he painted visions of her walking through halls lined with chandeliers. All of this, he'd say, is waiting. His voice was smooth as river stone, his touch calculated, every gesture rehearsed like a play on stage. He was the future as the town liked to imagine it, bright, orderly, and untouchable. The drifter spoke less. He never promised a mansion, never even promised comfort. When he did talk, his words carried the plain truth of a man who had seen too much of the world to dress it in lace. He offered her a cabin, a fire burning low, and his company when the storms rattled the plains. What he lacked in polish, he carried in raw certainty. His kiss was not gentle, it was the kind that left a mark, the kind a woman felt long after she pulled away, the kind that tangled the air between what she wanted and what she feared. The town noticed. Whispers rose in the general store, murmurs spun over glasses in the saloon. Some said she'd be foolish not to take the mayor's son, that to walk away from such a future was madness. Others watched the drifter and said nothing, for they knew a man like him could not be measured by coin or promise. He was a storm, and storms carved their own paths. She found herself torn between the golden promise of tomorrow and the rough, immediate fire of the present. Her days were filled with longing glances, with hands brushing against hers at church doors, with words left unsaid that weighed more than speeches. Nights were harder still, for in her dreams she saw herself in silk gowns under chandeliers, yet she also felt the pull of the drifter's calloused hands and the fierce honesty. In his kiss, the land itself seemed to take sides. The mayor's estate stood high and proud, its frame rising with each beam laid, proof of wealth and order. Out beyond the last fence post, the cabin the drifter claimed leaned against a line of pines, smoke curling steady from its chimney, stubborn and real. Two worlds, both calling, both demanding. The people of the town waited too. Some bet on the mansion. Some bet on the cabin. A few, the quiet ones, knew this choice wasn't just hers. It was a mirror for everyone who had ever been caught between the life they were told to want and the one that burned in their chest. The mayor's son pressed harder with each passing week, his gifts growing larger, his promises sweeter. His world was one of certainty, a place where her every step would be planned and her every need met. The drifter, by contrast, gave her nothing she could hold except the memory of his touch and the steady rhythm of his voice when he said, "I ain't got much, but what I got is real." And so the days stretched into weeks, each hour tightening the knot between them, each glance sparking questions with no clear answer. It all came to a head one evening, when the sky burned orange with the setting sun, and the prairie wind carried the scent of rain. She stood at the edge of the wooden cabin, its rough-hewn logs glowing warm against the fading light. The drifter stepped closer, his shadow falling across her face, his hand braced against the wall. His eyes locked with hers, and in that instant, the world shrank to nothing but the sound of her breath and the pounding of her heart. He leaned in, and she felt the truth of his offer, the fire, the cabin, the storm of his kiss. No promises of chandeliers, no velvet lies. Only him, raw and unyielding, as if the land itself had shaped him to match its wildness. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the church bell rang, calling the town to evening prayers. But neither of them moved. Between the fading day and the rising night, the choice loomed closer, heavy as thunder, and though she knew the mansion waited with its polished floors and shining windows, her lips trembled with the taste of something far more dangerous, something she might not be able to walk away from. The storm broke overhead, rain striking the cabin roof, the wind howling through the valley. And in that moment, she realized the future was no longer a matter of promises or mansions. It was about the fire that already burned, the kiss that had already claimed her, and the question that would haunt her until she gave her answer. Would she choose the golden promise of the mayor's son or the savage truth of the drifter's kiss? The prairie held its breath, waiting. The rain did not let up that night. It pounded the plains, drummed on rooftops, and carried a restless song across the valley. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped and crackled, sending sparks up the chimney while the drifter sat by the hearth sharpening his knife. His hands moved slow and steady, as though storms and choices alike could not shake him. He did not speak much, yet his silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, that made a person lean forward waiting for words that might never come. She sat near the window, watching water streak down the glass and blur the shape of the pines. The storm outside was wild, yet what raged inside her heart was worse. She thought of the mayor's son with his smooth words and elegant promises, of the life he painted with such surety. Then she thought of the drifter, of the way his presence alone filled the air until it was hard to breathe. One offered the safety of a mansion, the other offered the risk of a cabin built with his own hands. The town would never understand why that risk seemed harder to walk away from. In those days, life on the frontier was never gentle. Families rose and fell on the turn of weather or the sweep of sickness. Gold fever had driven many west, leaving behind grave markers carved into wood and prayers whispered into dust. A man like the mayor's son could promise grand halls because his father's name was tied to railroads, banks, and land deeds. A man like the drifter had nothing but the strength in his arms, the grit of his will, and the reputation of never staying in one place long enough for the past to catch him. The townsfolk told stories about him, though none matched. Some said he had run from the war with blood on his hands. Others swore he had been a rancher whose land was stolen by men with more power. A few whispered he was once on the wrong side of the law. The truth was tangled, hidden behind eyes that rarely gave anything away. Yet what could not be denied was that he worked hard for every scrap of bread, every roof beam on that cabin, every fire that warmed the night. The mayor's son, by contrast, had never dirtied his hands. He wore boots polished to a shine and coats pressed so smooth they looked foreign against the dusty streets. His voice carried in the courthouse, his laugh echoed in the saloon. The people smiled when he passed, not because they admired him, but because they feared the weight of his father's power. When he promised her a mansion, He did it with the certainty of a man who had never been told no. Still, he courted her with patience. Flowers brought from the city, silk ribbons wrapped in boxes, dinners at the long table of the mayor's house. The other young women in town looked on with envy, whispering of how lucky she was. To them, the choice seemed obvious. Yet they had never felt the cabin's warmth in a storm, never known what it was to be held in silence instead of paraded in the light. Her father leaned toward the mayor's son. To him, security meant everything. Years of hard work on the land had taught him that a steady hand and steady coin meant survival. He reminded her of the hardships she'd already seen, the winters when food was scarce, the springs when crops washed away, the funerals that came too early. He believed the mansion was more than luxury. It was a shield against the cruelty of the land. Her mother was quieter. She saw the fire in her daughter's eyes when the drifter's name was spoken, though she never said a word. She had once known such fire herself before settling into the rhythm of town life. Some nights, when the house was still, she would sit by the window and wonder if her daughter's choice would lead to freedom or ruin. The drifter never asked for her decision. He never demanded, never pleaded. He simply lived, building fences, cutting wood, mending the roof when the wind tore shingles away. His way of loving was not through gifts or words, but through presence, through the way he stood at her side when others would not. He was a man who carried storms on his shoulders and did not flinch. The mayor's son, though, began to grow restless. His pride, sharpened by years of being praised, was pricked by her hesitation. He had never been forced to wait for anything in his life, and the thought that a nameless drifter could hold sway over her unsettled him. His smile remained polished, but underneath it lay an edge. He began to speak of timelines, of commitments, of how long a lady could be expected to waver before making her choice. The town, sensing the tension, leaned closer to the story. Every glance on the street carried weight. Every whispered conversation at the mercantile seemed tied to her. They watched her every move, some rooting for the mansion, others silently hoping she would choose the cabin. To them, it was more than gossip. It was a reflection of the struggle between old order and new grit, between power built on names and power earned in sweat. Days passed into weeks, and the storm of her heart only grew. She remembered nights when the drifter's hand brushed hers, the steady heat of it grounding her like roots to earth. She remembered mornings when the mayor's son arrived with polished horses, offering rides through the fields where laughter felt easy but also rehearsed. Both men pulled her in different ways, each revealing not just who they were, but who she might become if she chose them. The land itself seemed to echo the struggle. The rains fed the mayor's fields, bringing promise of a wealthy harvest. Yet out beyond town, the cabin's garden sprouted wildflowers, stubborn in their survival, painting color against the wilderness. Each place carried its own kind of beauty, its own promise of tomorrow. One evening, as the sky deepened to violet, she walked through the town alone. Lanterns flickered in the windows, the sound of a fiddle spilled from the saloon, and the smell of bread drifted from the bakery. At the courthouse steps, the mayor's son stood waiting, his coat pressed, his hand resting on the rail. He smiled when he saw her, but in his eyes was something she could not quite read. He spoke again of the mansion, of the grand rooms already being prepared, of the life that awaited if only she would give her word. His voice was calm, but beneath it she heard the steel of expectation. For the first time, she wondered if the mansion was truly for her, or if it was simply another jewel for him to claim. She found herself at the edge of the pines where the drifter's cabin stood. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the sound of an axe splitting wood echoed steady into the dark. He glanced up when she approached, his eyes catching the glow of firelight. He did not ask why she came. He simply split another log, stacked it neatly, and said, "Storm's comin' again tomorrow." His words were plain, yet they grounded her more than any polished promise ever could. She stood there in the scent of pine and smoke, the sound of steel against wood filling the night, and knew her choice was no longer between comfort and risk. It was between truth and illusion. Still, she did not answer. She could not. The weight of both futures pressed hard on her chest, and the town's whispers grew louder each day. The mayor's son began to press harder. The drifter remained steady, and she was caught in the middle of a storm that would not end until she chose which path to walk. And as the days shortened and the winds grew colder, it became clear that her choice would not only shape her own life, it would shape the town itself. For the mansion and the cabin stood as symbols of two very different futures. The fire in the cabin burned low that night, casting long shadows across the walls. She sat by the window once more, watching the storm gather on the horizon. Lightning flickered in the distance, thunder rolled across the valley. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when she would finally decide. But the storm had only just begun. The storm rolled in heavier than before, thunder cracking over the plains and wind bending the pines until they moaned like old timber. The rain fell in sheets, flooding the dirt streets of town and hammering the rooftops. By morning, the roads had turned to mud, wagons stuck at crossings, and the people whispered that it was a sign. They always looked for signs in storms. Some said it meant fortune was coming. Others warned it was a curse. For her, it felt like a mirror of what was twisting inside. The mayor's son had grown more determined, his polished boots splashing through puddles as he strode from one corner of town to the next, speaking of progress, of wealth, of his father's vision for the future. He spoke of the railroad stretching farther west, of new markets and new people, of how his mansion would not stand alone but as the heart of a greater estate. His words painted him as a man leading destiny itself. The people listened, nodding, though many wondered what destiny cared for them. At the same time, the drifter's presence had begun to weigh heavier on the town. He had taken work fixing fences, mending wagons, and hauling supplies for farmers too weary to do it themselves. He asked for little in return, sometimes nothing at all, which only deepened the town's unease. A man with no name tied to deeds, no land beyond the cabin, and no promise but his own strength unsettled those who relied on rules and order. They whispered about him in hushed tones, warning that his kind brought trouble. Yet when the trouble of life came, it was his hands that carried the weight. The tension spread beyond her own heart. Family spoke of it at supper, choosing sides without ever saying so. Some fathers pushed their daughters to smile at the mayor's son, to stay in his circle, believing his power would shield the whole town. Others muttered about the drifter's grit, saying that men like him built more than promises, they built survival. The air thickened with quiet arguments and long stares across pews at church. What had started as her private burden was becoming the town's divide. Her father's pressure weighed heavier each day. He spoke of how rare it was for a girl to catch the eye of such a man, of how their family could finally rise above the endless toil of the land. He looked at her with tired eyes, worn from years of bending his back to soil that gave little. His voice carried the desperation of a man who had fought too long to see his daughter choose a harder life when an easier one was within reach. She loved him for his sacrifice, yet she felt the chains in his words. Her mother watched in silence, her face lined with years of holding back truths she had never spoken. At times, her gaze fell on the drifter with something like memory, as if she recognized the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to belong more to the land than to the people living on it. But she never told her daughter what she saw. She only gave small warnings to be careful, though her tone carried more hope than fear. One evening, as lanterns flickered in the streets, the mayor's son arranged a gathering at the courthouse. He stood tall before the crowd, his voice ringing with confidence as he spoke of the mansion nearly finished, of the fine wood brought in from the east, of the chandeliers already polished and ready to be hung. He invited the town to witness its completion, to step inside and see the future. The people applauded, some with genuine excitement, others with forced smiles. He was not just building a home, he was building a stage, and she was expected to be at the center of it. That same night, the drifter worked late at his cabin, driving nails into a new porch beam while the crickets sang. His cabin did not shine with chandeliers, nor did it carry the grandeur of a mansion. But it was alive with warmth, built plank by his own hands. The smoke rising from its chimney was steady, the kind that promised shelter in storms. Those who passed by might not have seen its worth, but she felt it each time she crossed the threshold. It was not a promise of wealth, it was a promise of belonging. The rivalry between the two men began to show openly. At the saloon, when their paths crossed, the air grew so tense even the piano fell quiet. The mayor's son would smile with his polished charm, offering drinks to the men around him while the drifter stood silent, his stare unblinking, unmoved. They did not raise hands or voices, but every man in the room felt the weight of what simmered beneath the surface. The town's lawman watched carefully, his hand always near his belt, for he knew such rivalries rarely ended with words. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Some said the mayor's son had already arranged for her hand, that it was only a matter of time before a wedding was called. Others whispered that she had been seen near the cabin too often, her figure in the lamplight against the logs, a sign of where her heart leaned. Each version of the story grew larger until truth and rumor blurred. She could not walk down the street without feeling the eyes on her, without hearing the hush that followed her steps. She began to notice the change in the mayor's son most of all. His polished charm had begun to crack. His words grew sharper, his tone colder when she hesitated. He reminded her not just of his love, but of his power, of how he could shape the life of her family with a single decision. It was no longer just a promise of mansions, it was a warning of what might happen if she refused. The drifter, though, never pressed. He said little, did little to sway her, yet his presence carried a pull stronger than any promise. When storms came, he was there. When fences broke, he fixed them. When she stood at the edge of his porch, he simply looked at her, waiting, as if her choice was her own and not his to take. It was that patience, that steady fire in his silence, that left her torn. Meanwhile, the town's own troubles deepened. The railroad promised wealth, but it also promised strangers, lawless men drifting through with nothing to lose. A group of them had already passed through, stirring trouble at the saloon, nearly leaving a man dead in the street. The mayor's son spoke loudly of law and order, of the need to protect the town's image for business. Yet it was the drifter who stepped in that night, pulling the wounded man from the dirt, carrying him on his shoulders until he was safe. The people saw, though few spoke of it. One morning, the blacksmith's wife came to her quietly, slipping a loaf of bread into her hands. She whispered that a life of comfort was not always a life of peace, that gilded walls could feel like cages. Then she walked away, leaving her to clutch the bread and wonder how many others saw what she saw. The conflict no longer lived only in her heart. It spilled into every corner of the town, into every whispered prayer, every glance exchanged at the market, every hymn sung in the church. The mansion was rising, its windows catching the sunlight for all to see, while the cabin stood steady in the shadows of the pines. Two futures, each pulling at her with equal force, each demanding she decide. The mayor's son began preparing for an announcement, one that would force her hand. The town buzzed with expectation, waiting for the day he would stand before them and claim her as his bride. She felt the weight of it pressing closer, suffocating in its certainty. Yet the drifter remained unshaken, his silence louder than any vow. His kiss still burning on her lips each night she closed her eyes. The storm clouds gathered once more on the horizon, darker than before, thunder rolling like distant drums. The town braced itself, though none knew whether it was the sky or the hearts of men that would break first, and she stood between them still, the mansion glowing with promise on one side, the cabin steady with truth on the other, her heart caught in a storm that had no end in sight. The days shortened and the air grew colder. Autumn came swift, its winds tearing leaves from the trees and scattering them through the muddy streets. The town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to snap. The mansion rose taller with each passing week, its walls gleaming in the weak sun. Chandeliers already hung inside, though the doors had yet to be opened. The mayor's son spoke louder than ever, hosting gatherings, showing off polished rooms, and promising that once she gave her answer, the town would see its future begin. Yet whispers turned sharper. Men in the saloon spoke of strangers moving along the rail line, men who carried knives and played cards until fights broke out. Wagons were robbed near the valley, and a rancher's barn was burned in the night. The lawman was stretched thin, and though the mayor's son promised order, it was the drifter who seemed to keep watch when trouble crept close. He said little, but he was there in the shadows, steady as the earth beneath their feet. The mayor's son began to grow desperate. His polished charm gave way to a steel edge, his voice no longer a song but a command. He reminded her of the wealth his mansion offered, of the comfort her family would gain, of the respect she would carry as his wife. His words no longer dripped with sweetness. They pressed heavy, as though her hesitation insulted the very order he lived by. He did not shout, but the look in his eyes carried a warning. The drifter, on the other hand, remained silent in his way. He continued building, repairing, watching. But silence was not weakness, it was strength wrapped tight. The townsfolk noticed, even if they did not admit it aloud. When a wagon overturned on the ridge, it was the drifter who hauled children free while others stood frozen. When a fire spread too close to the mill, it was his hands that drew buckets in the night. He did not speak of his deeds. He did not need to. She felt herself drawn tighter into the storm. At night she lay awake, her mind pulled between the two worlds. The mansion gleamed in her dreams, golden halls stretching wide, a life without want. Yet when she woke, it was the cabin she longed for, the smell of pine smoke, the warmth of firelight, the way silence could feel like belonging. Her father pressed harder than ever. He begged her not to throw away security, not to risk everything for a man whose past was unknown. His voice cracked as he told her he had worked his whole life to protect her from hardship, and now she stood ready to walk back into it. He did not see her heart, only the danger of her choice. Her mother, though quiet, began to watch with eyes that seemed to know the storm could not be stopped, only endured. One evening the town gathered at the saloon for music and cards. Lanterns glowed against the wood. Laughter filled the air, and for a while the storm outside seemed forgotten. But when the mayor's son entered, the room shifted. He carried himself like a man who owned it all, coat crisp, boots polished, his smile cold as he ordered around for the men. Moments later, the drifter stepped through the door, his hat dripping rain, his eyes sweeping the room. The laughter faded. Every card game paused. The tension in the air was so thick even the fiddler lowered his bow. The two men locked eyes across the room. No words passed, but the silence carried the weight of 100. The mayor's son raised his glass, a smirk playing at his lips, while the drifter stood still, his hands resting loose at his sides. For a long moment the whole town seemed caught between them, as if the choice itself had taken human shape and stood ready to strike. Then the saloon doors burst open, and a stranger stumbled in, bloodied and bruised. He cried out that bandits had taken the north road, that wagons were burning, that the valley was no longer safe. The lawman rushed forward, but he had only so many men. Panic spread fast, mothers clutching children, men shouting orders. And in the chaos, the mayor's son promised to ride at dawn to lead men against the threat, to protect what was his. His words rang proud, but some saw the tremble in his hand as he lifted his glass. The drifter said nothing. He turned and left into the rain. Yet by morning he was gone with his horse, heading north before the mayor's son had even gathered his riders. The people spoke of it in hushed tones. Some called it reckless, others called it bravery. She knew it was neither, it was simply him, moving without waiting for permission, carrying storms on his shoulders as he always had. When the mayor's son rode out later that day, he carried a dozen men with him, banners flying, voices loud. They looked like soldiers marching to war, though few had ever seen battle. The town cheered, though the cheers carried more fear than hope. She stood among the crowd, her heart split. She thought of the drifter already deep in the valley, facing danger alone, and of the mayor's son riding with the weight of his father's power. Two paths, both shadowed with risk. Days passed without word. The town grew restless, waiting for news. Rumors flew. Some said the drifter had been seen fighting near the ridge. Others swore the mayor's son had turned back when the bandits proved too many. No truth came, only whispers. Each night she stood at the window, watching the horizon, listening to the thunder that rolled across the land. At last, one evening, a rider came staggering into town. His horse was lathered with sweat, his face pale with fear. He shouted that the valley was burning, that the bandits were more than any had guessed, that the mayor's son's men were scattered. Some were dead, others missing. The town fell into chaos. Women wept in the streets, men grabbed rifles, the lawmen cursed the sky. And still, no word of the drifter. Her father told her it was proof that safety was gone, that she must choose now before all was lost. Her mother stood silent, her face pale, her hands clenched tight as if bracing for a blow. She felt the storm inside reach its peak, her chest tight with dread. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the thunder outside. That night the church bell rang, calling the town together. The mayor himself stood on the steps, his face drawn, his voice strained as he declared that order would be restored, that the mansion would not fall, that his son would return. His words carried weight, but not certainty. Behind him, the mansion loomed against the storm, its windows glowing, its doors still waiting for her answer. But in the shadows beyond town, a lone rider moved through the trees, carrying with him the smoke of battle and the scent of fire. His figure was hard to see, blurred by rain and night, yet those who caught a glimpse swore it was him, the drifter, returning from the valley. Whether he carried victory or ruin, none could yet tell, and she stood in the center of it all, the town watching, the storm raging, the mansion and the cabin both waiting. Her heart pounded, her breath caught, and the world seemed to narrow to this single moment. The story was not yet finished, but every thread had tightened, every choice had sharpened, and the air itself felt ready to break. The night was black as coal when the rider came into town. Rain streaked his face and thunder rolled over the valley, but his figure was steady in the saddle. The people poured into the street with lanterns, their voices hushed, their breath caught as they tried to see through the storm. When the horse stopped, mud splashing beneath its hooves, it was the drifter who swung down, his clothes torn, his arms streaked with blood, but his eyes sharp and alive. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then whispers spread like sparks. Some cried out in relief, others shrank back, afraid of what his return might mean. He said nothing to the crowd, only glanced toward her. That look was enough. It told her he had faced the storm, and somehow he had come back from it. The lawmen stepped forward, asking what had become of the mayor's son and his men. The drifter's answer was plain. They had ridden in strong, banners flying, but when the fight turned ugly, most scattered. The bandits had been many, too many for men who had never truly faced blood and fire. Some had fallen, others fled. The mayor's son had been taken, held somewhere deep in the valley. The drifter had stayed as long as he could, cutting through fire and steel, but he could not bring him out alone. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Mothers pressed their children close, fathers cursed under their breath. The mayor himself stood frozen, his pride faltering under the weight of the words. For the first time, the glow of the mansion seemed dim, its shining windows trembling against the storm. She watched it all unfold, her heart twisting. She saw the people look at the drifter, saw their fear and their awe. He was no polished man with promises. He was scarred and worn, but alive, and his silence told more truth than any speech could. In that silence, she saw the answer she had been searching for. The days that followed tested the town more than ever. The lawman gathered what men he could to ride again, and though some hesitated, many knew they would not follow the mayor's son. Instead, their eyes turned to the drifter, waiting for him to lead. He never asked for the role, never claimed it, but when he mounted his horse and rode back toward the valley, they followed. He did not promise victory. He only promised to stand beside them. That was enough. The battle that came after was spoken of for years. The bandits were ruthless, their fire spreading through the hills, their knives gleaming in the dark. But the townsfolk, led by the drifter, fought with grit they had never known they carried. It was not banners or speeches that drove them, it was survival, and the steady presence of a man who asked nothing but gave everything. When the smoke cleared, the bandits were driven out, leaving the valley scarred but free. The mayor's son was found alive, though broken. His pride was shattered, his polished charm gone. He had fought, but fear had undone him, and it was not him the people looked to when the dust settled. His mansion still stood tall, but its windows no longer gleamed with promise. To many, it looked more like a monument to power that could not hold when the storm truly came. For her, the choice was no longer tangled. She had seen both paths through fire and shadow. The mansion promised walls against the wind, but those walls could not keep out emptiness. The cabin, small and simple, carried warmth and truth that no storm could wash away. She chose the cabin, not because it was easier, but because it was real. Her father struggled to accept it. He could not let go of the dreams of safety he had built for her. Yet in time, he saw the way she carried herself beside the drifter, saw the fire in her eyes that had dimmed under the weight of the mayor's son. Her mother, quiet as always, gave a small smile when she saw them together, as if she had known all along this would be the end of the story. The town changed after that. The mansion was still there, its halls filled with polished wood and chandeliers, but it stood quieter, less proud. People walked past it without the same awe. They spoke instead of the valley, of the night the drifter led them, of the strength they had found in themselves. The cabin, hidden among the pines, became a symbol in its own way, not of wealth, but of survival, of truth, of the power of a steady hand in storms. The mayor's son never regained his shine. He walked the streets with his head lowered, still carrying his father's name but not the same weight. He learned in silence the cost of promises that were not backed by grit. Some pitied him, others scorned him, but most simply turned their eyes elsewhere. His mansion remained his, but its walls echoed with emptiness. She and the drifter built their life quietly. The cabin grew, plank by plank, room by room. It was never grand, but it was strong. She planted flowers by the porch, bright against the wood, and in the evenings they sat together watching the smoke curl into the sky. The storm still came, as storms always do, but they faced them together. In time, the whispers in town faded. People stopped asking what might have been if she had chosen differently. They saw instead what was, and they could not deny the truth of it. Some still envied the mansion, its tall walls and wide rooms, but more envied the peace they saw in the cabin, the laughter that drifted from its windows, A life built not on promises, but on presence. Years later, children would ask about that storm, about the bandits, about the night the town nearly fell. The old folk would tell the tale of the mayor's son and the drifter, of the mansion and the cabin, of the choice that hung heavy over the valley. Some told it as a warning, others as a lesson, but all agreed it was the night the town changed. For her, it was never a story of choosing between wealth and struggle. It was a story of choosing between illusion and truth. The mansion had offered a dream painted in gold, but dreams fade when storms break. The cabin had offered nothing but a place to stand, yet it was enough. Because it was real. As she looked back on it in later years, she understood the heart of it. Life was not measured by the size of walls or the shine of chandeliers. It was measured by who stood beside you when the rain fell hardest, when the wind tore through, when the night was at its darkest. The drifter had offered her a cabin and a savage kiss, and though the world had doubted it was enough to last a lifetime, the town carried on. The valley healed, and the storms came and went as they always did. But deep in the pines, where the fire glowed and laughter rose with the smoke, the cabin stood steady. And in that place, their story found its end, not in grandeur, but in truth. The lesson lingered long after, carried in whispers and remembered in silence. Promises of mansions fade, but the strength of a steady hand, the warmth of a true home, the fire of a love chosen freely, those remain. And so the tale of the mayor's son and the drifter was told, not as a story of riches, but as a story of what it means to face the storm and stand unbroken.